and a very warm welcome to the interview here on France 24. EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker has launched an unprecedented investigation into whether his predecessor, José Manuel Barroso, broke EU rules by taking a job at Goldman Sachs. That's the bank blamed for the economic crisis that began in 2008. Juncker's action came after EU ombudsman Emily O'Reilly called on the Commission to clarify its position on the issue. Well, we're joined now by Miss O'Reilly. A very warm welcome to the show. Firstly, the investigation has now been launched by the Commission. Are you satisfied that genuine action has been taken?
Well, it's certainly a step because originally when Mr Barroso took the job, the official reaction of the Commission was that he hadn't broken any rules. He'd waited 18 months before he moved to this particular job, and that was it. And that was it for several weeks. I stood back and I waited to see whether they were going to change in light of the very public concerns and very widespread concerns that had been raised about this matter, not least among EU staff members themselves. And when I saw that there was no movement, I wrote, as you said, to President Juncker, really inquiring as to what the Commission's settled position was on this. And as a result of that, as you know, President Juncker wrote back and he has now asked the Ethics Committee, which is supposed to vet these sort of appointments by former commissioners, to have a look at it. And that's where it stands now. So I've asked, well, I don't have control over the Ethics Committee, but I think they should move as fast as possible, as fast as reasonably possible, to make a report on this so that we can see what their evaluation is, and more critically, how the Commission will respond to whatever it is they say, because it's important to note that they are an advisory committee. The Commission doesn't have to do what it suggests they might do. So
will you be keeping, because also I believe this ethics committee, they don't have to make public their conclusions. Will you be keeping a close eye on that? What kind of action can you take, following the reaction from the Commission?
Well, I have called in the past, suggested to the Commission that the Ethics Committee should release all of its reviews, reports on these matters. So far that hasn't happened, but I think in this case it's going to be, quite frankly, unavoidable because whether they're under a legal obligation to do so or not, I think the public and indeed the moral pressure on them to do so, or for the Commission to publish the report, will be immense, and I don't think that the Commission can move away from that, can duck from that.
But then what actually will happen to Barroso? He doesn't seem like he's willing to relinquish the post at the Goldman Sachs bank. The only thing the EU Commission can do really is take his pension away from him, if I understand correctly. And I'm not sure that will bother him to that extent, will it? It will, really it's the EU institutions and citizens that lose at the end of the day anyway.
Well, I mean, I'm not investigating Mr Barroso as such. What I'm looking at and what I am investigating and looking into is how the Commission deals with this matter, because these are all governed by a particular Article 245 in the treaty, which compels commissioners, indeed all people involved at high levels in the EU, to act with integrity. And what I've simply asked President Juncker to do is to ask the committee to see whether Mr Barroso's actions square with or in line with Article 245. What the Commission can do, the Commission can't actually do anything itself other than refer a case to the European Court of Justice and request, if they deem it is appropriate, that Mr Barroso be deprived of his EU pension, and then the court will make a decision on that.
Of course, another thing Jean-Claude Juncker did was say that Barroso would not be treated in the Commission with the pomp and ceremony, if you like, of a former president, but rather he'd be treated like any other lobbyist and would have to adhere to transparency rules. But those transparency rules are voluntary, are they not? So, how do you think people in general, there's a human connection, an address book and personal relations don't expire after 18 months?
Well, of course, and a lot of these people have very extensive and very influential networks, and that's the main reason why they are employed and why the private sector is so interested in them. But I think President Juncker said what he said in relation to, as it was described in some newspapers, some media, as depriving Mr Barroso of his red carpet rights as a former Commission President, because I had asked him whether he had given directions to Michel Barnier, the man who is charged with conducting some of the Brexit negotiations for the Commission, whether he had given directions or guidelines to Mr Barnier, or indeed any EU official who might come in contact with Mr Barroso as to how their dealing should be with him. And I think he was responding to that. I mean, I agree that the transparency of lobbying isn't as it should be. It's a lot better within the EU institutions, I should say, than in a lot of other member states. But I think in any event, there will be a lot of scrutiny on this. But I think it was very important for the sake of the EU staff that Mr Juncker made clear how Mr Barroso should be treated when he comes with his in relation to his private sector job.
Indeed, a lot of those European staff signing the petition to try and get the Commission to act on this. Now, you mentioned there Michel Barnier. He's now the commissioner for the Brexit, if you like. He did serve under the Barroso Commission. He was then in that finance sector. Would it be going too far if Barroso stays, the advisor to Goldman Sachs for the Brexit negotiations, and you have his former commissioner working for the Commission on the Brexit issue? Should the EU look at Barnier's position? Should they maybe relook at that?
Well, look, I don't know. All of that is speculation. I know those issues have been raised. One imagines that any official, a former official or whatever, acting in those in that very important role will act with the utmost discretion and integrity, as one would expect. I mean, I think even if the EU institutions, I mean, there are many hundreds, if not thousands, of people, work there. You're going to have those particular connections. You're going to have those particular networks, and you can't account for all of them. And of course, at the end of the day, you have to also trust the integrity of people when they're involved in very important public interest work. I think it would be a pity if we became too suspicious of everything.
And too cynical. But at the same time, not the first commissioner to actually take a job at Goldman Sachs. He replaces, as he not, an Irish commissioner, Peter Sutherland. We also had an Italian commissioner, another one join. This revolving door between business and politics, you have actually looked at in the past, indeed just after you took office as EU ombudsman. Has it improved over the last few years? How common is it that we see that revolving door between politics and business?
Well, it's very common. And I think I notice this becoming an issue much more and more globally. I mean, a lot of people have pointed out recently that, making the point that a lot of prime ministers, presidents now get to high positions when they're relatively young, and therefore, while they're still in their 50s, that they're out, and obviously they've had a very interesting, very exciting job as president, prime minister, commissioner, what happened, and obviously they want to continue at a high level. I mean, it's been pointed out that President Barack Obama will only be 55, having served 2 terms as US president. So it's a big issue. But I think what's good about the Barroso case is that it is forcing institutions within the EU and elsewhere to really look at this particular nexus between politics and business, because you can also make a connection. I was reading reports of the recent G20 summit in China. And a lot of prime ministers, the leaders over there, were agonising about, the downside of globalisation and income inequality. And I think a lot of their concern has been expressed simply because those issues are now beginning to impact on their own political base. We see Brexit, we see the success of Mr. Trump in the US and so on. And suddenly they realise that public concern has reached a point where they themselves are being damaged politically. And therefore, this sort of revolving doors issue, even if it involves just a single individual and a single company, such as Mr. Barroso and Goldman Sachs, in a way, it highlights a much bigger and more important issue. And therefore, I've said on a few occasions, they can't, on the one hand, lament the fact of populism, Brexit, all of this, and then on the other hand, ignore issues that actually feed into the concerns that is provoking people to take the positions they are.
Indeed, as ombudsman for the EU, you're the person EU citizens can go to complain or question how they see those institutions working. As you mentioned there, we're seeing a rising Euroscepticism, if you like. We've seen the Brexit. Do you think in general people are feeling more and more detached from what they describe as an EU elite?
if I'm speaking honestly, which I am, yes, I do. And I suppose, this is why I think there's a certain level of frustration at the way in which the Commission reacted initially to Mr. Barroso's appointment, when they sort of stonewalled, hid behind the rules and the law, and didn't see, or at least in public, whatever they were saying privately, didn't see the wider issue. And I think it was very noticeable that during after President Juncker's State of the European Union address in Strasbourg just last week, when Mr. Nigel Farage stood up, the first thing he did was to congratulate Mr. Barroso on his appointment to Goldman Sachs. So, there is the connection, the uber populist, if you like, Brexit, and knowing that that is the sort of touchstone issue that feeds into the sort of concerns that in turn lead to Euroscepticism and indeed support for people such as Mr. Trump or indeed Mr. Farage, either in the United States or the UK or wider.
But Ms. O'Reilly, thanks so much for your time and joining us here on France 24. Thanks also to you at home for having watched. That brings us to the end of the interview. See you again next time.